Mara Voss had a habit of standing at the back of every room, not because she was shy, exactly, but because she had learned early in life that the back of the room was safer. At the back, no one compared you to your sister. At the back, no one asked why your wolf had not yet awakened at 19, when most wolves in the Crescent Peak pack awakened at 16. At the back, you could watch the world arrange itself around people like Celeste and simply breathe. Celeste was everything the pack admired. She was tall, gracious, and sharp in the way a well-made blade is sharp, beautiful and dangerous and perfectly balanced. She laughed easily and spoke well and had the kind of face that made older pack members nod with satisfaction when she walked into a room. Their mother had raised her like a gift being wrapped for a very specific occasion, and that occasion, it turned out, was Alpha King Darien Ashvale. Darien was 28 years old and had led the Crescent Peak pack for 4 years. He was not the kind of man who filled a room with noise. He filled it with stillness instead, the kind of stillness that made people lower their voices and stand a little straighter without knowing why. He had dark eyes, a calm face, and the quiet authority of someone who had never once needed to raise his voice to be obeyed. For 2 years, Celeste and Darien had been brought together at pack dinners, council events, and seasonal ceremonies. Their parents arranged proximity and called it courtship. The pack whispered that it was only a matter of time. Celeste smiled her careful smile and waited, and Darien, who was more dutiful than romantic, accepted the arrangement with the same steady composure he brought to all things. Mara watched all of it from the back of every room. She had first met Alpha Darien properly when she was 17, during a routine perimeter check in the Eastern Forest. She had been cataloging medicinal herbs for the pack's healer when he came through the tree line with 2 of his warriors. She had straightened up from the ground, muddy at the knees, hair tied in a loose knot, holding a bundle of dried root, and he had stopped and looked at her. It lasted 2 seconds, maybe 3. In those 2 seconds, something inside Mara had lurched so violently that she had gripped the herb bundle with both hands to keep herself upright. Her wolf, the quiet, late thing that had barely stirred in 2 years of waiting, had risen up from wherever it had been sleeping and pressed against her ribs like it was trying to get out of her body entirely. She had said, "Good afternoon, Alpha," in a perfectly level voice, and he had nodded and walked on, and she had stood in the forest for a long time afterward, very still, pressing her hand against her chest and telling herself she had imagined it. She had not imagined it. She knew she had not imagined it. But knowing something and being able to do anything about it are 2 entirely different things, and Mara was very good at deciding what could not be done. Celeste wanted him. Their mother had built 2 years of quiet groundwork toward this union. Their father, a beta of modest influence, had staked something real on the hope that his eldest daughter would one day stand beside the Alpha King. To speak up, to say what she felt, would have been an act of destruction aimed at everyone she loved. So Mara said nothing. She became very good at saying nothing. She watched the courtship progress through 2 more years of carefully managed occasions. She helped Celeste choose jewelry for pack dinners. She listened to their mother practice talking points about lineage and stability. She went to sleep many nights with her wolf pressed quietly against the inside of her chest, patient and certain, and completely unhelpful. And she ignored it the way you ignore a wound you have decided not to treat. The night of the binding ceremony arrived in early winter, when the moon was full and the air over Crescent Peak smelled like pine and cold stone. The great hall had been decorated with white flowers and silver lanterns, and every member of the pack had dressed in their finest. Mara wore a gray dress that she had owned for 3 years. She stood in the 3rd row between a pack elder who smelled like cedar and a young warrior who kept shifting his weight. She held a small glass of ceremonial wine and told herself to be present and calm and happy for her sister. Celeste stood at the front of the hall beside Alpha Darien. She was luminous. She wore white, and her hair was arranged in a way that had taken their mother 2 hours, and she was, by every visible measure, exactly where she was supposed to be. Elder Vina, the pack's high seer, began the ancient rite of moon confirmation. The rite was old, older than the current pack structure, older than the Ashvale bloodline. It called on the moon goddess to witness a mated bond and seal it before the community. In every ceremony and living memory, it had been a formality. The seer spoke the words, the sacred stone glowed, the fire burned bright, and the bond was confirmed. It took perhaps 4 minutes. Elder Vina raised the silver chalice. The fire at the altar burned blue-white, as it always did. She spoke the words in the old language, her voice steady and practiced. The stone did not glow. A small silence opened in the room, the kind of silence that happens when something expected does not occur. People glanced at each other. Elder Vina steadied herself and tried again. The full sequence, all the ritual words, the offering of blood from both Darian and Celeste pressed to the stone. Nothing. In 30 years of ceremony work, that stone had never failed to glow. The silence in the hall changed quality. It went from confused to careful, the way a crowd goes quiet when they sense that something real is happening, not something ceremonial. And then the great window broke. It did not shatter violently. It did not spray glass across the room or cause anyone to cry out. The circular window at the far end of the hall, old hand-blown glass set with the pack crest, simply opened outward, as gently as a door being held for someone. The full moon outside was so bright and so present that it felt, to everyone who was there, less like light and more like attention. The column of moonlight that came through the open window moved. People would argue about this for years afterward. Some would say it was the angle of the moon, the shape of the opening, a trick of winter air. Others would not argue at all, because they had been in the room, and they had seen it with their own eyes, and they knew that light does not move the way that light moved that night. It passed over the altar. It passed over Celeste, who stood perfectly still in her white dress with an expression that would later be described by witnesses as a woman watching something she already knew was coming. It traveled the length of the hall with a slow, deliberate certainty, and it stopped. It stopped on Mara. She felt it before she saw it, a warmth on her face and shoulders, a sudden loosening in her chest, as though something she had been holding tightly for 2 years had simply been taken from her hands. She looked up, and every elder in the hall was looking at her, and then she looked toward the front, and Alpha King Darian Ashvale was looking at her, and his face had changed. He had the face of a man who had just heard a truth he could not argue with. His wolf recognized her. Whatever careful composure he had carried into that room did not survive the moment the moonlight named her. He made a sound that was not a word, low, involuntary, the sound of something being confirmed at a level far below thought, and every wolf in the room felt it. Mara set down her wine very carefully on the shoulder of the elder beside her, who accepted it without comment. Celeste did not scream. She did not fall apart in front of the pack. She was, above all things, a composed woman, and she stayed composed now, but the composure cost her everything she had. She looked at her sister across the length of the hall, and what passed between them was too complicated and too private to be put into words, and too honest to be denied. She knew, she had perhaps always known, somewhere quiet and unwilling. Their mother sat down in the nearest chair with no memory of choosing to sit. Their father stood very still with his hand on the back of a chair and did not speak. The pack would later count that he stood that way for 23 minutes, and this detail, precise, almost funny, deeply human, was the detail most often repeated in the years that followed. The High Council met within the hour. Mara was brought to a small anteroom off the main hall, while the elders and Darian and the pack's senior advisors discussed what had happened and what it meant. She sat on a wooden bench and listened to the sound of formal conversation happening behind a closed door, and she spoke honestly to her wolf for the first time in 2 years. She said silently, in the way wolves and their human halves speak to each other, "Do you understand what this means for Celeste? For our parents? Do you understand what it costs?" Her wolf was patient. It had always been patient. More patient than Mara, more certain, more willing to simply wait for the world to catch up to what it already knew. It did not answer in words. It showed her instead the weight of 2 years of silence, the mornings she had pressed the bond down like something shameful, the ceremonies she had stood through, clapping, while her whole body leaned like a compass toward a direction she refused to acknowledge. And then it showed her something else, that none of this was a theft. The bond had existed before Celeste's courtship, before the family's plans, before any of it. The moon did not arrange things to wound people. She arranged things according to a truth that ran deeper than human timing, or human preference. And sometimes that truth surfaced at the wrong moment, in the wrong room, in front of everyone. Mara walked back into the council chamber when they called her. She stood before the elders and the Alpha King, and she said that she accepted the bond. She said it without performance, without apology, and without the particular brand of false humility she had spent years practicing. She said she had known for 2 years, and had said nothing out of love for her family, and she said she understood that this did not make it easier for anyone, and she was not asking for it to be easy. What happened next was not a fairy tale. Mara knew this, and she was glad she knew it, because fairy tales end at the moment of recognition and spare you the months that follow. The months that followed were hard. Celeste left Crescent Peak 3 weeks after the ceremony. She went to the Northern Territory where she had distant family, and she began building a life that belonged entirely to her, not to her mother's planning, or her family's ambitions, or a courtship that had always been more arrangement than feeling. It took time. It was not graceful, but it was real, and real things, even difficult ones, have a way of growing into something solid if you let them. Mara and Celeste did not speak for 2 years. When they finally did, a brief conversation, a morning phone call, both of their voices careful, it was not forgiveness exactly, and it was not resolution exactly. It was 2 women deciding to be honest with each other for the first time in a long time, and agreeing to start from there. Darian was not a perfect partner. Mara had not expected him to be. He was proud in the way that leaders become proud when they have been obeyed for a long time, and he carried the particular discomfort of a man who had nearly made a permanent mistake and had been corrected publicly. He worked at it. That was what she would say about him, later, when people asked, not that he was easy, not that the bond made everything simple, but that he worked at it every day with the same quiet consistency he brought to everything else, and that this, over time, turned out to be enough. The pack adapted. Communities are more resilient than their members expect them to be, and the people of Crescent Peak had seen something in that hall, something old and real and undeniable, and it changed how they thought about ceremony, about arrangement, about the difference between what is planned and what is true. Elder Vina said, at the next seasonal gathering, that she had performed the moon confirmation rite 41 times in her life and had never once seen the stone refuse to seal. She said she hoped she would not see it again, because her heart was too old for that kind of shock. The crowd laughed, and it was the right kind of laughter. Honest, a little shaken, grateful. They told the story for a long time after that. They told it to young pack members who were restless and uncertain about their bonds. They told it at ceremonies, quietly, as a kind of reminder. They told it most often to women who had learned to stand at the back of rooms, women who had gotten very good at making themselves smaller than they were, women who had swallowed something true for the sake of keeping peace, and had begun to believe that swallowing it forever was the only right thing to do. The story they told was not about the window breaking, though that was the part that made people's eyes go wide. It was not about the moonlight moving across the hall, though that was the part no one could explain. The story was about a woman who had known the truth for 2 years and had been too afraid to hold it, and the night the moon goddess looked across a crowded room and held it for her.